We invite you to join us as we explore one of the most disturbing instances in Ozark mountain history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. It was 1884. The isolated valleys and hollows of the Ozark Mountains were mostly unaffected by the passage of time, while the rest of America surged on into an era of industrial progress. Communities lived in almost total seclusion from the outside world in these prehistoric hills that cut over southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. A nameless community that was not included on any official maps of the time was tucked away near the modern town of Branson, about 42 miles from Springfield, amid the mist-covered mountains of southwest Missouri. One of the most unsettling periods in American history took place here, in an area that the locals just refer to as the Basin, and it would be hidden in county archives for almost 80 years. A census record from 1851, which notes the arrival of Josiah Blackwood, his wife Margaret, and their 3 children from an unidentified area in Tennessee, is the earliest known reference to the Blackwood family. The family claimed to be seeking isolation for religious reasons, which was a sufficiently common excuse in that age to avoid further questioning, according to the census taker. The Blackwoods' arrival is mentioned only once in local church records retrieved from the Methodist Episcopal congregation in Hollister, where they are described as peculiar in manner but firm in faith. This seemingly inconspicuous description would later assume a more sinister meaning when interpreted in the context of later events. They made their home in a secluded valley that was only reachable by a slender path that meandered through thick oak and hickory trees and across perilous gorges carved by ages of water flow. The Greene County Courthouse's land records show that Josiah paid a surprisingly low price for 156 acres of land from a homesteader named Ezekiel Porter, who was eager to depart these premises forthwith, according to the bill of sale. The records don't explain why Porter left the property so quickly, leaving behind improvements like a 2-room cabin and a partially built barn. This cryptic note, found by researcher Dr. James Harrington in 1952, would later be regarded as the first documented indication that something about the location itself inspired unease long before the Blackwoods made it their home. It reads simply, "Porter claimed Hollow was wrong somehow. Payment accepted despite incompletion of terms. It was written in a different hand than the main text in the margin of the land transfer document." It wasn't until 1953 that Harrington found a death certificate from Sacramento, California, dated 1852, identifying an Ezekiel Porter who had allegedly fled the Devil's Own Hollow in Missouri. Although it isn't possible to be positive that this was the same Porter who sold land to the Blackwoods, the timing and the specific reference to a Missouri hollow point to a possible connection. Porter's abrupt departure and apparent travel to the other side of the continent suggests some serious disruption, but it is unclear exactly what he went through while in the basin. During their early years in the Ozarks, the Blackwood family themselves did not immediately cause the dispersed neighbors and odd visitor any cause for alarm. According to several reports, Josiah Blackwood was a bearded, quiet, and independent frontier patriarch who was harsh but seemed normal. "I met a man of imposing stature and serious mien who identified himself as Blackwood. When I inquired as to the welfare of his family and offered to visit their homestead for prayer, he declined firmly but without rudeness, stating that they kept their own faith in their own way." According to a letter written by traveling minister Reverend Thaddeus Wilson in September 1852 and kept in the Springfield Ministerial Association's archives. In the mid-19th century American frontier settlements, where family-centered worship was prevalent and denominational lines were frequently blurred, this stress on religious self-sufficiency was not all that uncommon. The Blackwoods' gradual disengagement from even these few social contacts, however, would turn out to be important. Local merchant records show that Josiah's town visits had slowed from monthly to quarterly by 1855. Furthermore, by 1860, he was only seen twice a year, either by himself or with just grown men who were thought to be his sons. The Blackwood farmhouse had expanded significantly from its modest origins by 1884. According to tax records, The property had a main home, 3 smaller cabins grouped in a rough semicircle around the main house, a barn, a smokehouse, and other outbuildings. The arrangement of these buildings is depicted on a hand-drawn map that was part of the 1,880 tax assessment. It also includes notations suggesting cultivated fields, an apple tree orchard, and a spring that provided water for the property. The Blackwood property was situated in a natural depression surrounded by steep ridges on 3 sides, with elevations rising more than 800 feet from the valley floor, creating what geologists call a box canyon. The only way to enter the property was through a narrow path to the east that followed the course of what locals called Stillwater Creek, a tributary of the James River. In October 1884, rain washed out the only access road, starting a chain of events that would eventually reveal what many researchers later referred to as a society unto itself, governed by its own incomprehensible rules. The physical remoteness of the Blackwood estate isn't what makes this instance so deeply unsettling, though, rather, it's what decades of that isolation had led to. The topography formed a kind of natural fortress, protecting the occupants from the outside world. In his unpublished 1953 study, Isolated Communities of the American Interior, which detailed the case, Dr. James Harrington characterized the area as pathologically perfect for the development of a closed society. His field notes, which were found among his belongings after his disappearance in 1957, include hand-drawn maps of the property that demonstrate the extent of this isolation. According to Harrington, the acoustic properties of the basin are particularly noteworthy. Sounds do not travel beyond the ridgeline, nor do outside sounds penetrate easily into the valley. The effect is one of complete sensory isolation from the wider world. Before the Blackwoods arrived, there were stories in the local folklore compiled by Vance Randolph in his 1933 book Ozark Mountain Tales about the basin being a place where sounds don't belong. Randolph ascribed these stories to the superstitious nature of early settlers rather than any acoustic anomaly. 3 main sources provide us with information about daily life at the Blackwood homestead. Margaret Blackwood's journal, which was found in 1943 while renovating the Greene County Courthouse after it had apparently been misfiled among property records. Testimony provided to the Missouri State Police by the local postmaster Elias Whitmore in November 1884. And, most unsettling of all, the medical examiner's reports that were put together after what would later be whisperedly referred to as the intervention. These documents, along with loose correspondence and county records, enable us to piece together the events that led to what one official report simply described as conditions inconsistent with recognized human society. Beginning as a pretty traditional description of frontier life, Margaret Blackwood's journal includes comments about the difficulties of setting up a homestead in the isolated Ozark woods. Still, several sources attested to the Blackwood property's remarkable physical and sensory isolation from neighboring settlements, which fostered the growth of behaviors that deviated from social standards. The earliest records, which date from 1851 to 1853, are about clearing land, growing crops, and interacting with sporadic visitors. When she wrote in April 1852, "Josiah believes we have found our Eden. Here, away from the corrupting influence of towns and false churches, we may raise our children according to the true word." Although the book doesn't specify the nature of the family's views, these early notes imply that religious separatist was in fact the original reason they sought solitude. However, it is evident that the Blackwoods carried with them a certain understanding of biblical doctrine that would subsequently be used to defend their more obvious actions. The cryptic reference to old books recurs frequently in the early journal entries, implying that Josiah had texts other than the standard Bible, possibly apocryphal works or obscure religious commentaries that shaped his evolving worldview. In August 1852, an entry mentions Josiah's readings from the old books, noting that he finds in them the truth about the patriarchs and their ways, which the modern churches have abandoned. Around 1857, the journal undergoes a significant change as mentions of external contact become less frequent. More attention is paid to internal family dynamics, and Margaret's mounting anxiety at her husband's tightening control over their day-to-day activities in the entries. When she wrote in June 1857, "Josiah forbids the children from speaking to travelers now," the journal entries describe no contact with strangers by 1860, indicating that the family's isolation had become almost total. He says the outside world carries corruption in its very breath. The notebook also records a slow shift in the family's religious customs. In September 1858, Margaret writes, "Josiah has taken to leading the family in what he calls the old worship. The children must stand in a circle while he reads from his private book and makes marks on their foreheads with ash. I fear this is not the Christianity we brought with us from Tennessee." This suggestion of creating ritual practices specific to the family is consistent with later observations about the Blackwoods' unusual religious beliefs. Early entries mention traditional prayers and Bible readings, but by 1858, Margaret writes of Josiah's new rituals and ceremonies at the full moon. The journal entries that start to surface about 1861, when Rebecca, the eldest Blackwood daughter, would have been around 16 years old, are arguably the most unsettling. I don't know what he means, but his gaze scared me into silence when I asked him who he said, "Josiah has announced that Rebecca is to be joined soon." He stared at me as if I had said something stupid and replied, "To the family, of course, as it was in the beginning." On this topic, further posts are more mysterious, referring to Rebecca's preparation and the joining ceremony, but never explaining what these expressions meant. By 1863, the journal shows for the first time that Margaret was aware that something was seriously wrong in her family. "What Josiah calls purity, I can no longer recognize as such," she stated in her letter. This entry implies that by this time, the effects of what seems to have been multi-generational inbreeding were starting to show physically in newborn children. "The children born now carry the mark of our sin in their very flesh." Yet he sees this as proof of divine favor, saying that we are returning to the original state before the world was corrupted. The family that had come 30 years previously had expanded significantly by 1884. Following their arrival in the Ozarks, Margaret Blackwood gave birth to 7 additional children, according to baptismal records from a local church in Hollister. The latest birth was documented in 1863. Josiah Blackwood reportedly took every newborn child to be baptized, a habit he stopped after 1863 for unknown reasons, which is the only reason these records exist. These documents don't explain what happened to these kids once they grew up, or why there were never any marriages involving Blackwood children listed in Missouri or Arkansas County registries. The first thread that would eventually be plucked to reveal the dark tapestry of the Blackwood legacy was the absence of these records. There are hints in the baptismal documents themselves that something strange was going on in the household. This suggests that during Josiah's increasingly infrequent interactions with the community, signs of genetic abnormalities were becoming apparent even to outside observers. In addition to several of the later baptisms, notes include remarks from the officiating ministers such as, "Child appears unwell," or "Infant shows unusual features." In one instance from 1862, the minister wrote, "Requested medical attention for the child, which the father refused. May God have mercy on this family." The most thorough outside view of the Blackwood family was given by Elias Whitmore, who was postmaster of Hollister from 1855 until his death in 1892. According to his testimony, which he provided to investigators in November 1884, the Blackwoods would only visit the town 3 or 4 times a year, but each time they brought loaded wagons of ginseng root, animal pelts, and sometimes odd carved objects that were eagerly purchased by tourists who were visiting the area's recently opened health spas. The words they kept to themselves, said Whitmore. Whitmore's testimony also mentions that although Josiah would pick up mail during these visits, he never posted any outgoing letters, indicating the family had no communication with the outside world. Josiah did all the talking. The women, and there were several, never spoke. Not once, in all the years I knew them. They kept their faces hidden under bonnets, even in the height of summer heat. He'd ask for any mail for Blackwood, Whitmore said, but there never was any, not once in nearly 30 years. Whitmore's evidence becomes noticeably evasive when he is asked to describe the identities of the women who were with Josiah, indicating a hesitancy to discuss what he may have seen. His words: "There were resemblances, more resemblances than there ought to have been, if you take my meaning." Whitmore's account is supported by additional testimony from Thomas Gardner, the owner of the general store in Hollister, where the Blackwoods operated their sporadic business. "The old man, Josiah, he aged like anyone else," Gardner said. When investigators questioned Gardner about this, he allegedly responded, "I'm a God-fearing man. I don't like to speak ill without certainty." But there weren't enough different faces among them for how many there were. But the women with him, they had a sameness about them that wasn't natural. Year after year, they looked too much alike, if you understand me. The Blackwoods' purchases over the years are documented by Gardner's sales records, which are kept in the archives of the Taney County Historical Society. These records include not only basic supplies like flour, salt, ammunition, and tools, but also notable amounts of certain medical items like camphor, laudanum, and various patent medicines. According to an 1876 record, Josiah bought 6 bottles of Dr. Wilton's quieting syrup for nervous disorders, a remedy that is known to contain high levels of morphine. These purchases raise the possibility that family members were making an effort to control pain or other symptoms, possibly in connection with the physical ailments that medical examiners later reported. An exceptionally intense autumn precipitation that lasted for about a week in October 1884 served as the impetus that ultimately revealed the Blackwood situation. With precipitation topping 15 inches in some places, meteorological records from the time period characterize it as the most significant rainfall event to hit the area since measurements started in 1837. The deluge pushed Stillwater Creek over its banks, causing landslides that further isolated the basin and washing away the trail that connected the Blackwood property to the outside world. In early November, when Josiah did not show up for his scheduled appearance to pick up mail and supplies, local merchant Thomas Gardner allegedly told Sheriff Robert Ledbetter that the old man hasn't come down from the hollow. Court documents later filed indicate that the sheriff initially dismissed any concerns, stating that those mountain folk often go months without showing their faces. Authorities were not forced to look into the matter until December 3, 1884, when a hunting party under the command of James Holloway discovered signs of distress at the Blackwood property. Having taken a wrong turn while tracking deer, Holloway's party encountered a young woman, dirty and in considerable distress, wearing nothing but a tattered nightdress, despite the December cold. The woman could not or would not speak, and she led them to the edge of the Blackwood property before running back into the forest. According to Holloway's written statement, which is preserved in county records, from a distance, Holloway's group saw what he called figures moving about in a manner that struck us all as peculiar and troubling. A thorough description of the woman that raises the possibility of physical anomalies compatible with genetic illnesses is included in Holloway's statement. This clinical description, which is unusual for a layman in 1884, is explained by the fact that Holloway had briefly studied medicine at Washington University in St. Louis before returning to the Ozarks to manage his family's timber interests. Her eyes were set too wide apart and her jaw had a peculiar underhung quality. Her hands were misshapen, with fingers of uneven length. Most disturbing was her gait. She moved in a shuffling manner, knees turned inward, as if her very skeleton had formed incorrectly. The woman appeared terrified, not merely of us, but of the forest itself. She kept looking at the trees, as if they might come alive. It was the behavior of someone who had never been outside a confined space, someone to whom the open world was as alien and frightening as a different planet might be to us. This observation, which is also included in Holloway's report, is important in understanding the Blackwood family's isolation because it raises the possibility that at least some of the family members were kept in such extreme seclusion that they had never left the basin. Sheriff Ledbetter organized what documents call a party of concerned citizens to look into the Blackwood property after Holloway's story brought them back to town. On December 4th, the sheriff, 2 deputies, county physician Dr. Elias Porter, and 4 armed men from well-known local families set out for the Blackwood Hollow. The state of the path, which was still partially flooded out from the October storms, made their journey more difficult. They had to leave their horses around 2 miles from the property and continue on foot over increasingly challenging terrain, according to the sheriff's official report. Official reports with clinical detachment detailed what they found when they arrived to the farmhouse on the 5th of December, 1884. However, a more vivid description of what the party experienced may be found in Deputy Sheriff William Hayes's personal notebook, which was found among his belongings after his death in 1912. "The main house stood at the center of what I can only describe as a compound," said Hayes. "The approach was watched by figures in the windows of outlying cabins. These sentinels made no sound as we approached, but we could feel their eyes upon us. The smell reached us before we dismounted. An odor of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and something else. I lack the words to describe properly. Something wrong." According to Hayes's account, the investigative group first encountered neither welcome nor opposition, which led to an uncomfortable environment of watchful quiet as they got closer to the main home. "As we got closer, Joshua Blackwood came out of the main house," Hayes added. "He appeared much older than his years should have accounted for, with a long white beard reaching nearly to his waist and skin weathered to the texture of tanned leather. He showed no surprise at our arrival, nor any concern, but regarded us with the detached curiosity one might show an unusual insect." When Sheriff Ledbetter explained the purpose of our visit to investigate reports of a woman in distress, the old man smiled in a manner that turned my blood cold. "My family suffers no distress," he said. "We are as God made us and wants us to be." The main house's interior is described in great detail in Hayes's notebook, which also highlights the peculiar sleeping arrangements. The upper floor was divided not into proper bedrooms, but into small cells, each secured with a wooden bar on the outside. Within these cells were crude pallets, many bearing evidence of restraint ropes and leather straps fixed to the wall. Most disturbing was the central room, larger than the others, where we found the old woman, Margaret Blackwood, surrounded by what appeared to be a twisted attempt at feminine luxury, faded ribbons hanging from the ceiling, crude drawings of flowers on the walls, and disturbing dolls fashioned from corn husks arranged in a semicircle around her bed. The official report only says that when officers entered the main residence, they found 27 people of various ages living in conditions of extreme squalor and moral degradation. Hayes's more direct description reveals what this formal language hides. The inhabitants showed physical characteristics suggesting shared parentage across what should have been separate family lines. Many exhibited malformations of the skull and limbs. Some could not speak, but made animal sounds when approached. Most disturbing were the evident signs of familial relationships that violated every natural law and human taboo. Hayes continues by outlining the challenges the investigative team faced in pinpointing the precise connections among the different residents. When questioned, those who could speak identified themselves only as Blackwood, offering no given names or specific relationships. They referred to Josiah simply as father, regardless of apparent age, suggesting either a religious designation or a bloodline so convoluted that conventional terms of relation had lost all meaning. Additional unsettling findings were found during the examination of the property outside the main house. "The smaller cabins," wrote Hayes, "appeared to serve specific functions within the family's isolated society. One contained only women and girls, ranging in age from perhaps 5 years to 40, all engaged in repetitive craft work, weaving, sewing, and creating the strange dolls we had observed in the main house. Another housed what appeared to be a primitive school, with biblical texts written on slate boards and crude anatomical drawings that suggested a preoccupation with human reproduction. The third cabin served as what I can only describe as a nursery, containing 7 infants and young children attended by 2 women who bore such striking resemblance to each other that they might have been twins, though one appeared significantly older than the other. The county doctor who was called to examine the Blackwood family members, Dr. Elias Porter, declined to submit his full findings in the official file. His private medical journal, found after his suicide in 1887, contains detailed clinical observations of physical characteristics consistent with several generations of consanguineous relationships. But his report is riddled with redactions and references to conditions he declined to specify out of concern for public sensibility. I have observed in these subjects physical and apparent mental degeneration that can only result from sustained breeding among close blood relations, he stated. Some individuals show such extreme abnormalities that I question whether they can properly be classified according to established medical taxonomy. Several physical abnormalities seen in the Blackwood family members, such as asymmetrical facial characteristics, polydactyly, additional fingers and toes, unique cranial formations, and different skeletal malformations are precisely measured and clinically described in Porter's journal. His remarks about the apparent ages and likely relationships of the people he investigated are the most unsettling. These clinical observations point to a complex web of inbreeding that had lasted for several generations. Subject 14. Female, approximately 16 to 18 years of age. Shows physical characteristics suggesting she is both daughter and granddaughter to Subject 1, Josiah Blackwood. Subject 7. Male, approximately 30 years of age, appears to be both son and half-brother to Subject 14, while simultaneously being son and grandson to Subject 1. The family members' medical issues, such as high frequencies of seizure disorders, different developmental delays, and weakened immune systems, are also noted in Porter's notes. He wrote, "Many subjects show evidence of chronic infections left untreated, particularly of the respiratory system and skin. The overall health of the population suggests a gradual decline in viability that would, if continued, eventually result in complete non-viability of offspring." This clinical assessment lends credence to the idea that by 1884, the Blackwood family's isolation and inbreeding practices had become so severe as to threaten the family's survival. Porter's account of what he called the book, a document he saw in Josiah Blackwood's hands, is particularly noteworthy in his private notebook. The mysterious text was never found or formally recorded because it reportedly vanished during the chaos of the family's removal from the property. The subject constantly refers to a leather-bound volume written in a hand I cannot identify as any known language. When questioned about this text, he becomes animated, claiming it contains the original truth from before the corruption. He permits no one else to touch this book and keeps it on his person at all times. Among the numerous unanswered mysteries surrounding the Rise Blackwood case are its contents and place of origin. Josiah Blackwood, the patriarch, was by that time an old man, perhaps 70 years old. He allegedly failed to acknowledge when questioned by authorities that the living circumstances he had set up were in violation of any social norms. Sheriff Ledbetter testified that Josiah responded with real bewilderment when told he was being arrested. For what crime? This is my family. This is our way. Additional interrogation exposed a troubling mindset that had grown during the family's decades of seclusion. The old man spoke of purifying the bloodline and returning to the ways of the patriarchs. Hayes wrote in his journal. He cited biblical examples of familial marriages and spoke of his family as chosen to preserve what others had corrupted. Most disturbing was his evident pride in what he had created, as if the visible degeneration of his line was proof of its increasing perfection rather than its ruin. A thorough description of Josiah's explanation of his family structure, which the elderly man gave without seeming to recognize its abnormality, may be found in Hayes's notebook. He described what he called the circles of joining, wherein each generation was bound back to previous generations to strengthen what he termed the sacred essence. When asked directly if he understood that such practices resulted in the visible abnormalities among his younger family members, he responded that these were not defects, but the emergence of the original form before the world's corruption. He seemed genuinely unable to perceive the suffering his practices had inflicted on his own descendants. In her 60 seconds at the time, Margaret Blackwood was discovered sick and apparently oblivious to her surroundings in an upstairs chamber of the main house. She had advanced senility inconsistent with her chronological age, according to Dr. Porter's evaluation, which could be the result of chronic trauma or early mental degeneration. Her lucidity had eroded long before the authorities intervened, as evidenced by notes in her journal that were eventually retrieved and abruptly ended in 1869. The last readable entry begins. "The children have children now. Josiah says, 'This is how we remain pure. God, help me. I no longer know what purity means.'" Previous entries in Margaret's journal suggest that she is becoming more conscious of and opposed to her husband's increasingly unsettling behavior. In 1865, for example, the journal contains the following cryptic reference to the cave. "I tried to send Rebecca away when the trader came. Josiah found out. He has taken her to the cave. When they return, she will be changed like the others." This reference is made repeatedly in the journal, but always in relation to punishments or to people who tried to leave the family compound. Later academics conjectured that the cave might have been situated in one of the nearby ridges, possibly acting as a location for whatever ceremonial activities Josiah had established in addition to being a place of confinement, as no cave was mentioned in the official survey of the land. One particularly unsettling item from 1867 implies that Margaret, perhaps by compulsion or psychological manipulation, had become complicit in the family's practices. This entry implies that by this time, Margaret had been coerced into taking part in preparing younger female family members for what seemed to have been ritualized inbreeding practices. "I helped prepare Sarah today. I told her it was a blessing, as Josiah insists. I showed her the marks to make and the words to say. May God forgive me for this lie. There is no blessing in what we do, only continuation of something that should have ended long ago." Determining the precise relationships between the many residents of the Blackwood property was the authorities' first focus. Many of the younger generations were unable to talk clearly, and those who could gave conflicting explanations of their ancestry, making this practically impossible. Based on physical similarities and the scant material at hand, Porter tried to draw a family tree, but gave up after 3 pages of overlapping lines that, in his own words, more resembled a spider's web than any proper family tree. On December 12, 1884, according to the county court records, Judge Thomas Wilson ordered the Blackwood dependents to be sent to appropriate institutions where they might receive care consistent with Christian charity. This clinical language conceals what Hayes wrote in his journal as a scene of profound misery. The separation of family members who, despite the dysfunctional nature of their relationships, had known no other community, resulted in wailing that echoed through the courthouse and beyond. Sounds less human than animal, yet conveying human grief in their terrible intensity. During this procedure, there was a particularly concerning incident that was noted in Hayes's journal, but not in official documents. As the officers escorted her to the transport wagon, one of the younger women who had been identified as the daughter of Josiah's eldest daughter, Rebecca, broke away. But it soon became clear that the 3 Blackwood children who had first arrived in 1851 were the ancestors of a convoluted family tree that twisted back on itself in ways that were impossible to record. "Doctor," she screamed in a language no one could understand as she fled back toward the courthouse where Josiah was being detained rather than toward freedom. She bit her own tongue so hard while restrained that blood spurted from her mouth. Still, she kept making noises that seemed as though they were appealing to the patriarch. Hearing these cries from his cell, Josiah spoke in the same unidentified language. His authoritative voice instantly soothed the young woman, who then complied with her escorts. All witnesses to the episode were very troubled by the suggestion that the elderly guy had some kind of authority over his offspring that went beyond traditional familial ties. After being sent to the Missouri State Asylum in St. Louis, Josiah passed away 3 months later, according to the documents. without ever confessing to any crimes. The asylum physician's notes state that he insisted until his death that the world will one day understand the purity I have achieved. The other family members' fates are scattered throughout different from institutional records, with many of them seemingly passing away within years of being taken from the remote setting in which they had lived their entire lives. Although follow-up reports indicate that many of the youngest children struggled with both physical and social adaptation, they were placed in orphanages under false names in an apparent attempt to give them the chance to integrate into normal society. Several significant insights about Josiah's temporary institutionalization can be found in the asylum archives. Despite his great age and the primitive surroundings in which he had lived, Josiah demonstrated a startling amount of expertise on certain subjects, including ancient religious traditions and genealogical theory, according to attending physician Dr. Ambrose Wilcox. Wilcox documented multiple exchanges where Josiah elaborated on what he referred to as the science of blood purity, referencing obscure religious texts and historical precedents, with a fluency that implied he had at some point in his early life received formal education, a detail that is missing from the family's known history. This clinical observation suggests that Josiah may have suffered from a severe form of delusional disorder, which may have been made worse by decades of isolation and the unquestioned authority he exercised over his descendants. When confronted with evidence of physical and mental degeneration among his descendants, he interprets these as transitional forms necessary for the achievement of what he terms the final perfection. He appears genuinely incapable of recognizing suffering in others, particularly in those he considers family. What was most troubling was Josiah's seeming lack of regret or even awareness that his actions had hurt people. The subject maintains that his family represents a superior line of human development, stated Wilcox. Josiah died on the 17th of March, 1885, from pneumonia complicated by general debility, which was a common cause of death for old institution prisoners in the 19th century. Refused all medication during his final illness, telling attendants that the pure do not require the mixtures of the corrupted. According to a note in his file, he was buried in the asylum cemetery without any family members present. His last hours were spent writing non-stop in a language that no one could understand on any surface, including his own skin when paper was out of his grasp, according to a last note in his file. Researchers have never had access to these writings, if they have been preserved. In addition to the unsettling circumstances surrounding the Blackwood family, what sets this case apart in American history is the seeming conspiracy of silence that ensued. Official case documentation started to vanish from county records within months of the intervention. Newspapers that had first covered the discovery with grotesque interest suddenly stopped. The Blackwood family seemed to have vanished by 1886. Correspondence between Sheriff Ledbetter and Judge Wilson, which was saved by Ledbetter's grandson and made accessible to scholars in 1961, documents this methodical erasing. I concur that public knowledge of the full circumstances can serve no beneficial purpose, Ledbetter wrote in February 1885. Although later historians have questioned whether these stated motivations tell the whole story, this letter suggests that the suppression of information about the Blackwood case was motivated by a combination of civic pride and paternalistic concern for the youngest survivors. The reputation of our county and state would suffer unduly from association with such abnormality. Moreover, those innocents who might yet be saved from their heritage deserve protection from the stigma of their origins. When historian Eleanor Puite uncovered contact between Judge Wilson and a number of well-known Missouri families in the 1960 seconds, a darker interpretation of the record suppression surfaced, implying that the Blackwoods' isolation might not have been as total as official reports suggested. The matter we discussed regarding certain mountain folk has been resolved with complete discretion. All those with knowledge have been sworn to secrecy, and records are being handled appropriately. You may assure our mutual associates that no connection will ever be established. This cryptic passage appears in a letter written by Wilson to State Senator Thaddeus Crawford in April 1885. Some scholars have interpreted this oblique reference as evidence that the Blackwood family may have had unrecorded relationships with more respectable families in the area. Relationships that powerful interests were eager to hide. Local officials consistently obstructed Dr. Harrington's 1,953 probe into the tragedy. According to his research notes, he was repeatedly refused access to records that ought to have been made public. There appears to be a concerted effort to erase this incident from historical memory, he stated. According to Harrington's notes, one elderly woman in Hollister started to recount childhood memories of the Hollow people before her son entered the room and abruptly ended the interview. Elderly residents who would have been alive at the time refused to discuss the matter, changing the subject or claiming no knowledge, despite evidence to the contrary. One important finding from Harrington's investigation was the identification of Jacob Weaver, a former Missouri State Asylum orderly who had gone to Josiah Blackwood while he was institutionalized. Weaver, who was by that time in his 92nd, gave a thorough description of Josiah's last few months. Weaver recalled, "The old man wasn't like other patients." The case is further complicated by the intriguing suggestion that Josiah's influence went beyond his family and may have affected even trained medical professionals. He had a power about him, even locked in that ward. The other inmates would do whatever he told them, and even some of the staff seemed to fall under his influence. Dr. Wilcox spent hours talking with him, taking notes like a student with a professor. After the old man died, the doctor seemed changed, somehow, more withdrawn, obsessed with genealogy and ancient religions. He resigned his position 6 months later and vanished. Some said he went west to start a community of his own. The topic of Josiah's power and whether it depended on more than just patriarchal supremacy is raised if Wilcox was in fact subjected to psychological manipulation. This part of the story remains unsolved because no documentation of Wilcox's further actions has been discovered. Because of his perseverance, Harrington eventually found a cemetery with simple markers that just had dates and initials on what had once been the Blackwood property. According to his field notes, a large number of these dates fell within the years 1862, 1870, and 1877, indicating recurring incidents that led to several fatalities. Harrington's correspondence from this time period includes increasingly paranoid references to being watched and followed during his research trips to the Ozarks. He sent soil samples he collected from the site to colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis, but the results of any analysis were never published. In a particularly disturbing letter to the chair of his department at the University of Chicago, which was written in March 1957, Harrington wrote, "I am now convinced that the Blackwood case represents something more significant than an isolated instance of degeneracy, the systematic nature of the record suppression. The continued reluctance of locals to discuss the matter 7 decades later, and certain physical evidence I have discovered, suggest a phenomenon with deeper historical roots and possibly wider geographic distribution than initially supposed." There are indications that local authorities knew of the Blackwood situation long before the 1884 intervention, and that similar enclaves may still exist, in remote areas throughout the Ozark region. Other distant towns that Harrington had started to research are mentioned in his notes from this time period, including one in the extreme eastern reaches of Oklahoma and another in the Arkansas-Buffalo River region. He observed parallels in the locals' unwillingness to talk about these settlements, their strange religious practices, and their patterns of seclusion. This idea of a larger network of isolated inbred communities remained theoretical because Harrington's research was terminated before he could fully develop it. "There appears to be a shared origin to these cases," he wrote, suggesting either a common ideological source or possibly even direct connection between apparently separate communities. Harrington visited Springfield, Missouri in April 1957 to speak with an unidentified source who said he had access to sealed documents pertaining to the Blackwood case. He never came back after this journey. About 30 miles from the former Blackwood home, his abandoned vehicle was found at a rest area along Highway 60. After 6 weeks, The official investigation into his disappearance was concluded without any findings. Although conspiracy theorists have long maintained that the timing of this fire suggests a deliberate effort to suppress his findings, his research materials, which may have offered the most comprehensive account of the Blackwood case, were reportedly destroyed in a fire at his university office the night he vanished. When a hiker in the Mark Twain National Forest found a frayed notebook wedged in a rock formation's crack close to the former Blackwood property in 1963, it created an intriguing postscript to Harrington's disappearance. Days after his supposed disappearance, on April 15, 1957, Harrington wrote entries in his handwriting in the notebook, which was later given to the State Historical Institution after being turned over to local authorities. His interaction with the unidentified source, who reportedly handed him documents indicating high-level state government cooperation in hiding elements of the Blackwood case, is detailed in the fragmented notes. Found the cave. Matches running low. Strange markings on walls similar to JB's book. Someone else has been here recently. I hear. Is the final post, which is largely unreadable owing to water damage. It stops suddenly and doesn't explain Harrington's fate. The most recent documented investigation into the Blackwood case was carried out in 1965 by historian Eleanor Pwitt, who sought to track down the family members' descendants who were scattered throughout several institutions. Her research, which was published in a little-known scholarly journal just before it was shut down, indicates that a number of the younger Blackwood women had children while they were in institutions, and that these children were adopted without any documentation of their biological parents. The disturbing possibility exists, said Pwitt, that descendants of the Blackwood lineage have been unknowingly integrated into the broader population, carrying forward genetic material shaped by generations of isolation and inbreeding. Similar to Harrington's investigation, Pwitt encountered numerous records that were either inexplicably unavailable or had been destroyed during regular archival material purges. Her piece concludes with an unresolved issue, or by a deeper societal unwillingness to confront evidence that such extreme deviations from human norms could develop within our relatively recent national past. The existence of an anonymous trust fund created in 1886 to support the treatment of certain patients at different state institutions was one important finding reported in Pwitt's research. Although the beneficiaries of this trust were only identifiable by numbers rather than names, Pwitt's cross-referencing of the dates of admission makes it very likely that they were members of the Blackwood family. Although the source of this cash is still unknown, its existence suggests that someone with significant financial means was interested in making sure the family would continue to receive treatment, and possibly in keeping them out of the public eye. According to reports, the trust kept allocating money until 1932, when the final original beneficiary is thought to have passed away. Pwitt's research into the Blackwood case was abruptly stopped in late 1965 when she accepted a position at an Australian institution. In the weeks leading up to her departure, her coworkers said she had grown more nervous and that she had received anonymous threats telling her to stop her investigations. The trend of scholars leaving the Blackwood case under suspicious circumstances adds to the incident's sense of purposeful concealment, even though no proof of such threats was ever discovered. The potential link to local mythology that existed before the family's arrival in the area was an intriguing element of the Blackwood case that neither Harrington nor Pwitt thoroughly examined. Although Vance Randolph dismissed these as common mountain superstitions, it is hard to overlook the similarities to the Blackwood situation. Randolph's collection of Ozark folk beliefs contains multiple references to hollow folk or hidden people who were said to live in isolated valleys and follow old ways that normal society had. In Abandoned, it's possible that the Blackwoods weren't the first to form a remote community in the area. Instead, they might have been carrying on or resurrecting customs that had deeper historical origins if such stories were being told before 1851. Archaeological evidence found during a 1962 survey of the Mark Twain National Forest lends some credence to this notion. In a number of isolated valleys, archaeologist Robert Chambers recorded the remnants of what seemed to be previous settlements, including buildings that existed before European settlers arrived in the area. According to his findings, Some of these locations have evidence of ongoing residence long into the 19th century, which raises the possibility that some early settlers may have assimilated or absorbed the lifestyles of the previous occupants rather than driving them out. The mysterious finding that certain places displayed evidence of cultural practices inconsistent with documented settler communities, while Chambers does not provide any further details, is included in his study. The photographs in Chambers' report include geometric patterns and stylized human figures arranged in circular formations reminiscent of the circles of joining that Josiah Blackwood reportedly described to investigators. Of particular interest is his documentation of symbolic markings found carved into rock faces near several of these settlements, markings that bear no resemblance to known Native American petroglyphs or to typical frontier era graffiti. These symbols appear to constitute a coherent system of notation, Chambers wrote, possibly related to astronomical observations or to some form of ritual calendar. It is unclear whether these archaeological discoveries and the Blackwood case are directly related, but the similarities raise the possibility that the remote basin where the family settled may have had a longer history of odd living than previously thought. The Ozark wilderness has recovered the actual site of the Blackwood property. The access road had long since vanished under new forest growth, and aerial inspections in 1960 revealed no surviving structures. The area was essentially closed off to future research when it was added to the Mark Twain National Forest in 1968. The region is marked as part of an ecological research zone that is closed to the public on Forest Service maps, which do not indicate any prior settlement. Conspiracy theorists have speculated that the government is still concealing evidence connected to the Blackwood case as a result of this designation. Although there is no solid evidence to support such accusations, it is true that access to the area is still limited, supposedly for environmental reasons. In a 1997 interview with a local newspaper, a Forest Service official who asked to remain anonymous stated that certain areas within the forest were off-limits, even to most staff. But he gave no justification for the limitations other than evasive calls to sensitive research projects. Today, the Blackwood case is mostly a whispered legend among Ozark locals who have lived there for a long time, sometimes, but always without particular attribution. References to basin people or the Hollow folk appear in regional folklore collections. The real records are still dispersed over incomplete documents in several archives, many of which are only available to researchers who are already aware of exactly what they are looking for and where to look. Every now and then, intriguing new bits of knowledge surface. A sealed metal box concealed in a wall hollow was discovered during renovations of the former Taney County Courthouse in 2003. A hand-drawn map of what appears to be the Blackwood property, inscribed with symbols resembling those seen in Chambers' archaeological survey, was the only document in the box. Without a date or signature, the map's reverse is inscribed with the words, "Let this place be forgotten." County officials sent the map to the Missouri State Archives, where it is allegedly kept in restricted access storage that only researchers with special permission can view. When construction workers near Branson discovered a small cave filled with human remains in 1969, while removing dirt for a new roadway, it was the last unsettling conclusion to the Blackwood myth. The skeletons of at least 7 people were among these remains, according to the county coroner's findings, and they all displayed physical abnormalities that were comparable to those listed in Dr. Porter's confidential notes regarding the Blackwood family. Most unsettling was the placement of the remains, which had been arranged in a circle around what looked like a crude altar of stacked stones. Carbon dating of the remains revealed that they had been placed in the cave sometime between 1865 and 1870, which is when Margaret Blackwood's journal contained mysterious references to family members being taken to the cave. Before the remains were discreetly removed and purportedly sent to the State Archaeological Department for more research, the discovery was briefly published in local newspapers. Inquiries into the discovery were greeted with assertions that the remains had been misplaced during a departmental reorganization, and no published findings ever surfaced. The Blackwood case has been marked by a larger pattern of information suppression since its inception, which is consistent with this pattern of found evidence followed by institutional amnesia. Some of these remains were found in an unlabeled storage container, in the University of Missouri's Anthropology Department in 1998, according to a forensic anthropology graduate student. Her initial examination revealed genetic anomalies consistent with extended inbreeding, including atypical cranial formations and signs of polydactyly, as recorded in notes subsequently given to researchers. However, the remains were allegedly seized by the state archaeological department and once again vanished from the record before she could finish her research or publish her results. Citing political sensitivities surrounding the issue, the student's academic advisor advised her against taking the matter further. The Blackwood family story serves as a somber reminder of how a human group might vanish entirely from historical memory when its presence contradicts our core beliefs about family and society. It also begs the unsettling issue of what other untold tales of our country may be lost in the isolated nooks and crannies of America's vast interior landscapes, or buried in forgotten archives, tales that, like the Blackwoods, we have all decided to ignore rather than face. One can't help but wonder what other mysteries these mountains conceal, what other remote hollows might have societies molded by decades of isolation from the larger currents of human development. As the light fades over the ancient ridges of the Ozarks, some stories, it seems, are better left unsaid, and the hazy valleys show little to the uninformed spectator, and the villagers continue to exercise their customary caution when strangers inquire too much about the old days. It is best to avoid exploring certain hollows. The Blackwood case, however, continues to be a troubling example of what can happen when human societies turn inward too much for those who know where to look in the disjointed records, in the institutional histories, in the genetic legacy that may still manifest itself subtly among descendants who are unaware of their origins. It serves as a sobering reminder of what happens when seclusion is carried too far. Perhaps what is unknown about the Blackwood case is more disturbing than what is known. Erased from official history by people who thought the truth was too upsetting to be preserved, buried in lost records, or carried to graves by those who saw the intervention. We are left with pieces that allude to atrocities we can only piece together, as is the case with many of the darkest periods in history. And instead of being a loss of history, that partial understanding might be a blessing. Ultimately, the tangible proof of the Blackwood legacy has been recovered by the mist-covered hollows of the Ozarks. Time has eroded the tangible remnants of their existence. Vines have encased the rudimentary gravestones, and the forest has spread over the foundations of their homes. However, their case still raises important questions about human nature, the effects of isolation, and our ability to deviate from social norms when we are not influenced by them. These questions continue to reverberate quietly through the hidden valleys where the Blackwoods once carved out their unsettling, distinct reality. And maybe the Blackwood heritage lives on in some genetic thread that has been passed down through the generations, in some family line whose origins have been purposefully hidden, unknown, unacknowledged, but yet there in the larger American lineage. More than any other element of this troubling period in Ozark history, that notion could help to explain why so many people who are fully aware of the truth have opted for the ease of forgetting rather than the unsettling consequences of remembering. The wind makes noises that could be mistaken for human voices as it whispers through the woods as night descends over the old hills. The echoes of the Blackwood story. A warning from our past that some boundaries exist for reasons other than social convention, and that isolation can breed realities we find difficult to even understand, let alone accept as part of our shared human experience, can still be heard somewhere in the deepest hollows where sunlight hardly ever reaches.